The wind that night sounded like 1,000 wolves crying out across the frozen valley. The snow didn't fall softly the way it did in stories. It came sideways, biting through the air like shards of ice. The man inside the small wooden hut sat near his little heater, wrapped in 2 old coats, listening to the storm slam against the walls. He had been living out there for weeks, gathering data on winter storms, far from any town or road. It was a lonely place, but he had grown used to the quiet. He liked the stillness, the sound of the fire, and the feeling that the whole world had fallen asleep under the snow. That night, though, the storm was stronger than anything he had seen before. The wind rattled the metal latch on the door again and again. He pushed a log into the heater and watched the flame dance for a moment before he leaned back in his chair. His radio had gone silent hours ago. No signal, no voice, just static. He felt a little uneasy, but he told himself he'd seen worse. It was just another night in the mountains. Then, through the roar of the wind, he thought he heard something, a faint sound that didn't belong to the storm. At first, he ignored it. He thought it was the wind playing tricks. But then it came again, a knock. Faint, uneven, desperate. His heart jumped. No one came this far out in weather like this. For a moment, he sat frozen, listening. Then it came again. 3 quick knocks, a pause, then one more, weaker this time. He grabbed his lantern and walked to the door. The wind screamed the moment he unlatched it. Snow blasted into the room, stinging his face and eyes. He could barely see, but there was someone or something standing there, hunched over in the whiteout. Without thinking, he reached out and pulled the figure inside, slamming the door shut behind them. Snow covered the stranger from head to toe. The person, or what he thought was a person, collapsed to the floor, shivering violently. He hurried to close the heater door and then grabbed a heavy blanket from his cot, wrapping it around the stranger's shoulders. "You're safe now," he said, his voice calm but worried. "It's okay. You're safe." The stranger didn't respond. The body shook harder, as if from shock or exhaustion. He lifted the lantern higher to see the face. And that's when he realized something was wrong. The features were not right. The skin was pale, too pale, and had a strange shimmer to it like frost that refused to melt. The hair wasn't white but silver, reflecting the firelight in metallic tones. The eyes, when they slowly opened, weren't human eyes at all. They glowed faintly, like the reflection of stars in deep water. He took a step back. His breath caught in his throat. For a moment, neither of them moved. The stranger looked around the hut with wide, terrified eyes. Her breathing quickened, and she pressed her back against the wall, clutching the blanket as if it were a shield. Her gaze darted between him and the door, as if she couldn't decide which was more dangerous, the storm outside or the human standing in front of her. "It's okay," he said softly, raising both hands to show he meant no harm. "I won't hurt you." But his words seemed to make her even more frightened. She muttered something in a language he couldn't understand, her voice shaking. It sounded musical and strange, yet full of fear. Her body trembled as she pointed toward him, her hands shaking as though she expected him to attack. He didn't move. He didn't even breathe for a moment. Then slowly, he took the kettle from the heater, poured some warm water into a cup, and placed it on the floor in front of her. He stepped back, keeping his distance. "For you," he said quietly, gesturing toward the cup. She stared at it but didn't move. Her glowing eyes flicked from the cup to his face as if trying to understand his intentions. Minutes passed like hours. The wind howled outside, shaking the walls. Inside, the air was thick with tension and silence. Finally, she reached forward with trembling fingers, picked up the cup and sniffed it carefully. Then she took a small sip. The warmth seemed to calm her just a little. Her shoulders relaxed and her breathing slowed. He let out a slow sigh of relief and moved back to his chair near the heater. He didn't want to scare her again. He could tell she was exhausted, but she didn't close her eyes. She kept watching him, her gaze sharp and wary. He spoke softly again, though he knew she didn't understand. "You must have been caught in the storm," he said. "You're lucky you found this place." She tilted her head slightly, as if listening to the tone of his voice rather than the words. For a moment, her expression softened. Then she looked down at her hands, pale and thin, with a faint light pulsing beneath the skin. He noticed it too, the soft glow, almost like veins of light moving under her flesh. It didn't look painful, but it was something he'd never seen before. Whatever she was not from this world. He tried to reason through it. Maybe she was part of some secret experiment. Maybe she had come from a hidden aircraft crash nearby. But none of it explained her appearance or her fear of him. When their eyes met again, she flinched, pulling the blanket tighter. He realized then that she wasn't just frightened, she was terrified of him. He wondered why. He had saved her life. But to her, maybe he was the strange one. Maybe she had been told stories about humans, creatures to be avoided, dangerous, unpredictable beings. He felt a strange sadness at that thought. He wanted to show her he meant no harm, but he didn't know how. He moved slowly to the small table and took out a piece of bread from a tin. He broke it into pieces and placed one near her. "Eat," he said, pointing to it and then to his mouth. She didn't move. He took a bite of his own piece to show her. After watching him for a while, she hesitated, then carefully reached out for hers. She sniffed it, then took a small bite. Her expression changed. It wasn't fear anymore, but surprise, almost like she hadn't expected it to taste good. When she finished the piece, she glanced at him again, and for a brief second her eyes softened. Hours passed like that, the storm roaring outside while they sat in uneasy silence inside the little hut. The fire crackled softly, casting warm orange light over the walls. The man occasionally looked up from his chair to check if she was okay. Every time their eyes met, she looked away quickly, but she didn't seem as afraid as before. When he offered her another blanket, she accepted it this time. She still didn't speak, but her body language was calmer, less defensive. She even glanced at the fire once with a curious expression, as if fascinated by it. He watched her, trying to understand who or what she was. The longer he looked, the more human she seemed. In her small gestures, her shivers, and the way she held the cup close to her chest for warmth. At one point, she tried to speak again, pointing at herself and saying something softly. The word was unfamiliar, gentle, like a note in a song. He realized it might be her name. He nodded, repeating it carefully. She tilted her head, listening, and then repeated it again slowly, correcting his tone with a tiny smile that lasted only a second. It was the first time she had shown any emotion other than fear. He smiled too, quietly. It wasn't much, but it was a start. Outside, the blizzard howled endlessly. Snow piled high against the hut walls, sealing them in for the night. Inside, the two strangers, one human, one something else entirely, sat by the fire, sharing the small comfort of warmth and silence. Every once in a while, he caught her staring at him again, her expression unreadable. Sometimes there was fear, sometimes curiosity, and sometimes something softer, like wonder. He wanted to ask her so many things, where she came from, why she was here, if there were others like her, but he knew there was no way to communicate yet. Words were useless between them. Only actions mattered, so he kept his movements gentle, his tone calm, and his distance respectful. As the night went on, exhaustion finally caught up with her. She leaned back against the wall, the blanket pulled tightly around her, and her eyes slowly closed. The soft light from her skin dimmed, fading until it was barely visible. He watched for a moment, making sure she was breathing steadily, then turned down the lantern. The heater's faint hum filled the room. For the first time that night, he allowed himself to rest too. He lay on his cot, staring at the ceiling, still trying to believe what he had seen. A creature that looked almost human but wasn't. A woman who seemed as lost and frightened as any person in a storm. He didn't know what tomorrow would bring, but one thing was certain. The world outside his hut had just become a much bigger, stranger place than he had ever imagined. As he drifted towards sleep, the last sound he heard was the faint crackle of the fire and the steady rhythm of the wind outside. Somewhere in that sound, mixed with the storm, there was a strange calmness. He didn't know why, but he felt it, like something important had just begun. When the man woke up the next morning, the light outside was dim and gray. The storm hadn't stopped. The wind still howled, but it had lost some of its wild anger from the night before. Snow covered the windows like thick white paint, and only a faint glow came through. He sat up slowly, feeling the chill that had crept back into the air. The fire had burned low, just a few red embers left. Then he remembered her. He turned his head toward the corner of the hut, and she was still there, sitting near the heater, wrapped in both blankets. She wasn't asleep anymore. Her glowing eyes were half open, watching him quietly. For a moment, neither of them moved or spoke. The only sound came from the weak crackle of the fire. He gave a small nod and got up to add more wood to the heater. The sudden burst of flame startled her. She jumped slightly, clutching the blanket, and her glowing eyes widened again. He froze mid-motion, realizing she still didn't feel safe. He kept his voice calm and low. "It's okay. Just fire. Warm." He pointed at the heater, then rubbed his hands near it to show what he meant. Her eyes followed his movements carefully. She didn't reply, but her body slowly relaxed again. The glow from her eyes dimmed to a softer light. He could see she was still frightened, but not as much as the night before. He made a small breakfast, a bit of soup from dried vegetables and bread. When he placed a bowl near her, she looked at it with suspicion. He smiled and took a spoonful of his own bowl first, pretending to enjoy it more than he really did. That seemed to help. After a moment, she copied him. Her movements were slow, careful, almost like a child learning something new. As she ate, he noticed the faint color returning to her face. Her skin no longer looked like ice but had a soft glow under it, a strange mix of silver and warmth. She still hadn't spoken to him, though. Her gaze kept moving from the window to him and back again, as if she was planning an escape. He wondered if she even knew where she was. Outside, there was nothing but snow and wind for miles. Even a human would die in that storm if they tried to leave. Whatever she was, she must have realized that too. After a while, he took his small notebook from the table and began to draw. It wasn't something he usually did, but he needed a way to communicate. He drew a simple picture, a circle for the sun, some lines for snow, and a little figure of a person standing near a hut. Then he pointed at himself and said slowly, "Human." She blinked, tilting her head slightly, then looked at the drawing again. After a few seconds, she pointed at him too, repeating the sound softly, "Huh, man." Her voice was quiet but clear, a strange musical tone that echoed faintly in the room. It made him smile without meaning to. She had spoken her first human word. Encouraged, he drew another figure beside the first one, smaller with glowing eyes like hers. He pointed at it, then at her. She hesitated before touching her chest lightly. "Lyra," she said, though he couldn't tell if that was her name or her kind. Still, he repeated it gently. "Lyra." Her eyes softened just a little. For the first time, she didn't look afraid. The storm outside raged for the rest of the day. The wind screamed against the wooden walls, but inside the little hut, something had changed. The fear that filled the air before had started to fade, replaced by a thin thread of understanding. They didn't share a language, but the gestures, drawings, and tones between them began to build a fragile bridge. At one point, he noticed her touching a small crystal hanging from a cord around her wrist. It gave off a faint blue light when she pressed it, and she watched it as if trying to make it respond. He leaned closer, curious. The glow grew brighter, then faded again. Her face fell and she lowered her hand as if realizing it didn't work anymore. He guessed it might have been some kind of communication tool, something broken in the storm. She was alone here, maybe stranded, maybe lost. He wanted to help, but he didn't even know where to begin. When he reached for his notebook again, she tensed up immediately. He froze, realizing she was still cautious. He smiled softly and turned the page to show her another drawing. This time a picture of food, the heater, and two people sitting near the fire. He pointed to each picture, then to her and himself. "Safe," he said, putting a hand on his chest. "You safe here?" She stared at him for a long time, her glowing eyes narrowing slightly as if trying to decide whether she could trust him. Then slowly she nodded once, just once. But it was enough. Hours passed quietly. She spent most of her time near the fire, studying the things inside the hut. The metal tools, the radio, the small lanterns. Every time she touched something new, she seemed both fascinated and afraid. When she reached toward the radio, it suddenly crackled with static and she jumped back, her expression full of panic. He quickly switched it off and held up his hands again to calm her. "It's okay. Just a machine." She seemed to understand his calm tone and relaxed again. Her eyes wandered to the heater's flame. She stared at it for a long time, her silver pupils reflecting the flickering light. Then she whispered something under her breath, a few quiet words in her language, almost like a prayer. The man didn't interrupt her. He just watched, realizing how strange and human she looked in that moment. Lost, cold, frightened, but alive. As the day turned to night again, he could see her growing weaker. She tried to stay awake, but her eyelids kept closing. He knew she must have been through something terrible before finding his hut. When she finally lay down on the floor near the fire, he covered her gently with another blanket. She stirred slightly but didn't pull away this time. He sat back in his chair, watching her breathing steady out. Her face, though not human, had an odd kind of beauty in the firelight. The glow from her skin was faint now, almost gone, as if the storm had drained her completely. He didn't know if she would be able to survive out there again if the storm lasted much longer. He looked toward the window. The wind had carved strange patterns in the snow outside, swirling lines that almost looked like symbols. He wondered if she had come from above the sky. The thought sent a shiver down his spine. He'd always believed the universe held other life, but to see it so close, so real, and so scared, that was something else entirely. Late that night, he was startled awake by a sudden sound, a gasp, sharp and full of fear. The alien woman had sat up, her eyes wide open, glowing brightly again. She looked around wildly as if seeing something that wasn't there. Her breathing was fast, and she kept muttering the same word over and over. One hand pressed against her wrist where the crystal was. He rushed to her side, unsure what to do. "Hey, it's okay. You're safe. Nothing's wrong." He didn't know if she could understand, but his calm tone seemed to reach her. Slowly, her breathing steadied again. The glow from her eyes faded back to normal. When she finally looked at him, there was something different in her expression. Not just fear anymore, but confusion, and maybe a little trust. She pointed at herself, then at the door, and made a motion with her hands as if showing something falling. Then she pointed upward, to the sky. He understood. She had fallen from above. A crash, maybe. That explained her fear, her exhaustion, the broken device. He nodded slowly, pointing at the storm outside, then gestured, "Wait." She seemed to understand that too. Her shoulders lowered, and she looked at the fire again, silent but calmer. For the first time since she arrived, the air in the hut felt peaceful. The storm outside still screamed, but inside there was quiet. The kind of quiet that happens only after fear starts to fade. He sat near the fire again, writing in his notebook. Not about data or wind patterns this time, but about her, about the night she appeared out of the snow, the strange glow in her eyes, and how human her fear had been. Before he turned in for the night, he looked at her one more time. She was asleep again, her breathing soft, the faint blue light from her wrist crystal glowing gently like a heartbeat. He didn't know what tomorrow would bring, but something told him this was only the beginning. The storm might end soon, but the real mystery had just begun. As he lay back on his cot, listening to the wind soften outside, a strange calm filled the room. Two different worlds had collided inside a tiny wooden hut, bound together by nothing but survival and a flickering fire in the middle of a frozen wasteland. He closed his eyes slowly, and in the darkness behind them, he saw again the image of her face in the firelight. The fear, the wonder, the quiet spark of trust beginning to grow, and he couldn't help but wonder if she felt the same thing too. The morning after felt different. The storm had not stopped completely, but the wind was weaker now. The sky outside the small hut was still white, covered with endless snow, but the danger had passed. Inside, the air was warmer. The fire crackled softly, filling the quiet room with a faint orange glow. The man sat near the heater, half awake, holding a cup of tea. He watched as the woman, his strange visitor, stirred under her blanket. Her glowing eyes blinked slowly, adjusting to the light. She looked calmer than before, her movements not as tense. When she noticed him watching, she hesitated for a moment, but she didn't pull away. Instead, she sat up slowly, keeping the blanket wrapped around her shoulders. He smiled a little, trying to look friendly. "Good morning," he said softly, even though he knew she didn't understand the words. She tilted her head, her silver hair catching the light of the fire. Then she gave a quiet nod, as if she understood his tone, if not his language. He pointed at the cup in his hand, then to the kettle on the heater. "Tea," he said, pouring some into another cup and offering it to her. She took it carefully, her long fingers trembling slightly as they brushed the warm metal. Steam rose from the drink, and for a moment she stared at it like she was unsure what to do. Then, remembering what he had done yesterday, she raised it to her lips and took a small sip. Her expression softened instantly. The warmth surprised her. It was clear that she hadn't felt comfort like that in a long time. The man smiled again, feeling a strange relief. "See? Not poison," he said quietly, half joking but mostly to himself. After a few moments of quiet, he took out his notebook again. On one page, he drew a picture of the two of them sitting near the fire, just like now. Then he pointed at the drawing, then at her, and smiled. She leaned forward slightly, studying it. Her glowing eyes softened with curiosity. She pointed at the figure representing her and said softly, "Lyra." He repeated it with care. "Lyra." Then she pointed at him, her finger hovering just over the page. Her lips moved as she tried to say something close to human, the word she had learned before. But this time she seemed to be asking if he had a name, not just what he was. He pointed at himself again and said, "John." She repeated the sound carefully, "Joe," and it came out strange but gentle. He laughed quietly, not out of mockery, but because it was the first time she had spoken to him in a way that felt real. It was a small connection, but it was something. The hours passed slowly that day. The storm outside faded into a soft snowfall, and for the first time since she had arrived, the silence didn't feel heavy. Lyra spent time looking around the hut, touching objects carefully as if trying to understand them. She held a spoon like it was some strange piece of technology. When she touched the radio, it made a small crackle again and she jumped back. John quickly smiled and said softly, "It's okay. Just sound." She watched him closely, her face curious now rather than afraid. He showed her how it worked, twisting the knob to bring out faint static, then silence again. She leaned closer, fascinated, and when a voice suddenly came through, a weather report in English, she gasped and stepped back again, eyes wide. He quickly turned the radio off to calm her. He realized she didn't understand voices coming from nowhere. Maybe her world didn't use sound the same way, or maybe she thought there was someone trapped inside the box. The thought made him smile again. Everything about her was new, strange, and full of wonder. As the day went on, they tried to talk more through gestures. He pointed to the snow outside, then drew a small snowflake in the air. "Snow," he said. She watched his mouth carefully, then repeated the shape with her hands. "Snow," she said softly, almost whispering it. He clapped his hands once and smiled. "Yes, snow." She smiled too this time, a small, fleeting smile that made the whole moment feel warm. Later that afternoon, he went outside to check the snow level. The door creaked open and cold air rushed in. He could hear the soft whistle of wind through the trees. The world was white and silent. He took a few careful steps, checking the depth of the snow, then turned to see her watching from inside the hut. She stood at the doorway, her glowing eyes scanning the open space. There was something in her look, fear mixed with longing. He realized she might be remembering something. Maybe her ship, maybe the people she had lost in the crash. The way she hugged the blanket closer told him she wasn't just cold, she was lonely too. He pointed at the snow-covered world around them. "Beautiful, right?" he said softly. She didn't understand the words, but she seemed to feel the meaning. She looked up at the gray sky where soft flakes still fell and nodded slowly. When they went back inside, the room felt warmer than before. He handed her a small piece of dried fruit from his supplies. She took it hesitantly, then tasted it, her expression lighting up in surprise at the sweetness. He couldn't help but laugh again. That evening, he tried drawing more pictures to explain simple ideas. He drew the sun and the moon, pointing at them and saying the words slowly. Then he drew stars in the sky, and when he pointed to them, something changed in her face. Her expression turned serious, almost sad. She pointed at the stars and then at herself. Her eyes dimmed slightly, and she drew a circle in the air with her finger, then pointed upward again. John stared at her, realizing what she was saying. She wasn't from here. She had come from the stars. He didn't speak for a while. He just watched her, trying to process the truth. It was one thing to suspect it, but another to see her confirm it with her own hands. Lyra looked back at him as if waiting for his reaction. He didn't panic. Instead, he smiled softly and nodded. "It's okay," he said gently. "You're safe." Something shifted in her expression then. She stared at him for a long time, and for the first time he saw trust in her eyes. Real trust. She seemed to understand that he wasn't going to hurt her, that he wasn't afraid of her. That simple moment, shared in silence, felt bigger than any words could describe. The night grew darker and the heater hummed quietly. Lyra sat near the fire, tracing patterns on the floor with her finger, glowing faintly in the orange light. John watched her from his chair, still amazed that she was even real. He wanted to ask her so many questions, about where she came from, how she ended up here, what her people were like. But he knew it would take time. She still looked fragile, like a wounded bird learning to trust again. After a while, she looked at the notebook again and pointed at one of the empty pages. He handed her the pencil, curious. She held it awkwardly at first, studying it like it was a new tool, then began to draw slow, flowing lines. Her movements were graceful, almost too precise for a human hand. When she finished, she turned the page toward him. The drawing showed a large circular object, something like a ship, half buried in snow, with small trails leading away from it. He looked at it closely, then at her. She nodded, her expression sad. She pointed at the ship, then at herself, and finally made a motion with her hand as if it had fallen from the sky. His chest tightened as the truth sank in. She had crashed nearby. Maybe she was the only survivor. Maybe that was why she had been running through the storm last night. He put a hand on his chest, then pointed outside, toward the direction she had drawn. "We'll find it," he said, though he knew she couldn't understand. Still, the sound of his calm voice seemed to comfort her. Before going to sleep, she looked at him again and spoke softly in her language. The words were gentle, almost like a whisper carried by wind. He didn't know what they meant, but her tone was warm. He nodded, giving her a small smile. That night, when he lay down on his cot, he couldn't stop thinking about her. The world outside was silent again, but inside his mind everything was loud. Questions, curiosity, a sense of wonder he hadn't felt since he was a child. Somewhere deep down, he knew that meeting her had changed everything. He looked toward the fire before his eyes closed. Lyra was sitting quietly, staring at the small flame as if it reminded her of something far away. The light reflected in her eyes made them look even more human. As the fire crackled softly, she turned her head slightly, and for a moment their eyes met again. Neither spoke, but both seemed to understand one thing. They weren't enemies. They were just two souls caught in the same storm, trying to survive in a world that had suddenly become much bigger than either of them had ever imagined. The next morning came quietly, though the blizzard outside hadn't slowed down much. The snow still fell thick and heavy, hiding everything beyond the small hut. Inside, the fire burned low, filling the room with a dim orange glow. The man had barely slept. His mind kept going back to the strange woman sitting across from him, the alien who had stumbled into his life the night before. She was still a mystery, still something he didn't fully understand, and yet he couldn't stop looking at her. She sat by the fire, wrapped in the blanket he'd given her. Her silver hair was now dry, glowing softly under the light, and her skin looked less pale than before. She wasn't shaking anymore, but her eyes still followed his every move carefully. She didn't speak, but her silence said a lot. She still didn't trust him completely. Every time he made a sound or moved suddenly, she stiffened, as if preparing to run. The man understood that fear. He had seen that same look in animals before, when they didn't know whether to trust or flee. So he stayed quiet and slow. When he got up to add more wood to the fire, he made sure she could see what he was doing. When he poured water into a metal pot to boil, he moved gently. He didn't want to frighten her again. He sat back on the floor near the fire, his hand stretched out toward the warmth. The woman watched him closely, her eyes soft but uncertain. After a long silence, he pointed toward himself and said slowly, "Human." Then he touched his chest again. "Who, man?" She didn't react at first. Her head tilted slightly, as if she was trying to understand the strange sounds. Then she looked down, hesitated, and pointed toward herself. Her lips moved, releasing a word that sounded like soft music, a name or something close to it. He couldn't repeat it even if he tried. But he smiled, nodding, and pointed at her again, repeating the sound she made. For the first time, her expression changed. The tension in her shoulders eased slightly, and a faint spark of curiosity lit her face. It wasn't a smile, but it was something close, a small crack in the wall between them. Encouraged, he picked up his notebook and a pencil. He tore out a blank page and began to draw. The first sketch was simple, a circle with lines for arms and legs, a person. He pointed at it, then at himself again. Human. Then he drew another figure beside the first, but this one had larger eyes and a softer outline. He pointed at her. "You." She leaned forward slowly, her silver hair falling to one side. Her glowing eyes followed the pencil lines carefully, and for the first time she reached out to touch the paper. Her fingers were cool and smooth like glass. Then she took the pencil from his hand. He didn't resist. She stared at it for a moment, studying how it fit between her fingers, and then began to draw on the page. Her hand moved quickly, confidently. She drew stars first, small dots scattered above the two figures. then something that looked like a large circle, maybe a planet or moon, and a long line that seemed to represent travel or flight. When she was done, she looked at him as if waiting for him to understand. He stared at the picture for a long moment, then slowly nodded. "You came from there," he said softly, pointing at the stars. She didn't reply, but her eyes softened, and she gave a small nod. That was it, the first moment of real understanding. Hours passed as they continued this simple way of talking through drawings and gestures. He drew pictures of trees, mountains, and animals. She watched each one carefully and sometimes added symbols beside them, as if labeling them in her own language. It became a kind of game, a way to build trust without needing words. At one point, when he tried to draw fire, she laughed, a quiet, almost musical sound that echoed softly in the hut. He froze for a moment, surprised. The sound was light, pure, and alive. It reminded him of wind chimes moving in a soft breeze. For the first time since she had arrived, she didn't seem scared. He laughed too, not because he found anything funny, but because her laughter was contagious. For a few seconds, the blizzard outside felt far away. There was only warmth and the flickering firelight between them. When the laughter faded, she pointed at the drawing again, then looked toward the real fire. Her eyes reflected the flames like mirrors. Slowly, she reached her hand toward it. He quickly stopped her, gently taking her wrist and shaking his head. "Hot," he said, blowing air on his hand, pretending to be burned. Then he laughed softly. She tilted her head, curious. Then she mimicked him, blowing on her hand and smiling. That moment, small as it was, felt huge. Two beings from different worlds, finding common ground over something as simple as warmth. Later that day, he gave her food, some dried fruits and pieces of bread he had stored. She examined the food carefully before tasting it. The first bite made her pause. Then she nodded slightly and a tiny smile appeared on her face. It was such a simple gesture, but it filled the small hut with a sense of peace. They sat quietly for a while, eating together. The only sounds were the soft crackle of the fire and the faint howling of the wind outside. As evening came, he pulled out a small lantern and lit it, casting a soft glow across the room. The woman's eyes widened again, but this time it wasn't fear, it was wonder. She reached out to touch the glass, staring at the flickering light inside. Her lips parted slightly as if she wanted to say something, but no sound came out. He noticed that she looked tired. Her movements were slower now, her eyes half-lidded. He pointed to the bed in the corner, offering her a place to rest, but she shook her head and curled up near the fire instead, wrapping herself tightly in the blanket. He didn't argue. She seemed more comfortable there. As she closed her eyes, her face relaxed completely for the first time. The fear was gone, replaced by calm. He watched her for a moment before turning away, giving her space. He sat at his desk, writing notes in his journal. He didn't know what words could describe what he was feeling. It wasn't just surprise anymore, it was awe, respect, and a strange sense of connection. There was a life here, intelligent and real, who trusted him enough to sleep under his roof. It felt like a fragile piece, one that could break if he made one wrong move. Outside, the storm roared on, but inside the hut, time seemed to slow down. The world felt smaller, quieter. The man looked at the alien woman sleeping by the fire, and for the first time he realized something. She wasn't just lost. She was scared, maybe alone in a world that wasn't hers. He knew that feeling too well. Isolation, loneliness. It was something they both shared, even if they came from different worlds. When he finally lay down on his bed, he kept the fire burning low. The last thing he saw before closing his eyes was the faint glow of her silver hair in the dim light, like moonlight resting on snow. That night, as the storm raged on, the man and the alien woman, two strangers bound by chance, slept under the same roof. They didn't speak the same language, didn't share the same world, but something invisible connected them now. A quiet understanding born not from words, but from small acts of trust in a world that had suddenly grown much larger than either of them had ever imagined. The storm finally began to fade after what felt like days. The wind outside softened and the heavy snow no longer howled against the small wooden hut. Inside, the air was warmer now, and the silence felt strange after the endless roar of the blizzard. The man sat near the fire, stirring a small pot of melted snow for water, while the alien woman stood near the window, looking out into the white world. She had grown calmer over the past 2 days. Her fear had lessened, and though she still moved carefully, she no longer looked at him like he was a danger. Instead, there was something else in her eyes now, curiosity mixed with sadness. She often stared at the sky as if waiting for something or someone. That morning, when the light pushed through the fog outside, she began to act differently. She seemed restless, pacing near the door. Her hands trembled slightly, not from the cold, but from something deeper. The man watched her quietly. He could tell she wanted to go. He didn't stop her, but he didn't want her to leave in such a condition either. The cold was still brutal and the snow outside was deep. He gestured toward the fire, trying to tell her to wait, to rest a little longer. But she shook her head. Her glowing eyes moved toward the frozen landscape outside, and then she reached for the latch on the door. He stepped forward gently, blocking her path with his hand raised. "Wait," he said softly, pointing to the window. "Cold, dangerous." She stared at him for a long moment, then looked back outside. Her breath fogged in the air. Then slowly she nodded. For the moment she stayed, but he could see it in her face. Something was pulling her out there. After a long silence, she walked toward the table where his notebook and pencil lay. She picked them up and began to draw again. Her hand moved quickly, the pencil scratching softly on the paper. The man leaned closer, watching as shapes began to appear. Circles, lines, and strange symbols. When she was done, she turned the paper toward him. He stared at it for a moment, trying to understand. It looked like a rough map, mountains maybe, and a glowing mark near one of them. She tapped that glowing mark with her finger, then pointed out the window. "You came from there," he said quietly, more to himself than to her. She nodded. Then she drew another image, this time something that looked like a ship, small and round with trails of smoke or fire behind it. When he saw that, his breath caught. She hadn't just been lost in the storm, she had crashed here. Her next drawing made his stomach twist. She drew shapes that looked like dark figures surrounding the ship. They weren't human. Their outlines were sharp and uneven, and the way she pressed the pencil harder, almost tearing the paper, made it clear. She was afraid of them. He looked up at her. "They're looking for you," he said softly. She met his eyes and gave a slow, pained nod. Then she pointed at herself, then to the fire, then back at the window as if trying to say she couldn't stay long. She looked like she wanted to leave before they found her. The man sat in silence, his mind spinning. He didn't know what kind of beings were out there, or how far her people had come from. But he did know one thing: she was hurt, scared, and alone. And somehow, in this strange moment, she trusted him. He looked at her again, seeing the tension in her shoulders, the way her eyes darted toward the snow as if she could sense danger coming. He wanted to help her, but how could he? He had no way to contact anyone, no tools that could repair a ship from another world. All he had was this small hut, a few supplies, and his will to protect her. He stood and walked over to his coat hanging by the door. From its pocket, he pulled out a small flashlight and turned it on. The beam of light cut through the dim room. She flinched slightly at first, but then she looked curious. He pointed at the light, then at her drawing of the ship, then made a small circular motion, trying to ask if her ship also had light like this. Her eyes brightened. She nodded quickly and then pointed out the window again, tracing the air with her finger as if drawing symbols in the wind. The faint blue glow that followed her motion left him speechless. It wasn't light from a flashlight. It was something else, something alive. The glow faded after a few seconds, but the look on her face told him what it meant. She was calling to something, or trying to. He realized she might be trying to signal for help, maybe hoping her people would come back for her. The thought both comforted and scared him. If they came, what would they do when they saw a human? Would they think he had hurt her? Would they take her and destroy everything around to erase any trace? Still, he couldn't let her leave alone in the cold. He pointed toward the fire again, shaking his head, trying to tell her it wasn't time yet. She hesitated, then sat back down, clearly torn between wanting to stay safe and needing to go. The rest of the day passed quietly. They didn't talk much, but they didn't need to. He could sense her worry, and she could see his concern. They were both trapped between two worlds, waiting for something neither could control. When night came, the wind calmed completely, and for the first time, the sky cleared. Through the small window, the stars shone bright, thousands of them scattered like glitter on dark glass. The alien woman stood there staring at them, her eyes glowing brighter than ever, It was as if she recognized something up there, something familiar. Then suddenly she turned toward him, her face filled with emotion. She pointed toward the sky, then pressed her hand over her heart. He understood. Her home was up there. She turned toward the table again and picked up the pencil one more time. This time she didn't draw a ship or a map. She drew two figures, one human, one like her, sitting beside a small fire. Above them she drew stars. It was simple but beautiful. When she finished, she handed it to him. He looked at the drawing, then at her. "You," he said softly, pointing at the alien figure. "Me," he added, pointing at the human. She smiled faintly, a warm, quiet smile that carried more meaning than any words could. But as peaceful as that moment was, something changed outside. A low hum filled the air, distant at first, then growing stronger. The woman froze. Her eyes widened and her breathing quickened. She looked out the window, then back at him. He followed her gaze and saw a faint blue light flickering through the snow, far away but moving closer. It wasn't lightning and it wasn't a storm. It was something else. The hum grew louder. The woman looked terrified, not relieved. She pointed at the light, then to herself, and shook her head quickly. She wasn't being rescued, she was being hunted. He stood up, his heart racing. "We have to hide," he said. Not sure if she understood the words, but she understood his urgency. He grabbed her arm gently and led her toward the back of the hut, where a small trapdoor led to a storage space below the floor. It wasn't much, but it was better than nothing. She hesitated only for a second before nodding and climbing down into the dark space. He covered the trapdoor with a rug and sat on top of it, trying to act normal as the hum outside grew even louder. Through the window, a faint blue beam swept across the snow, moving slowly, searching. The man's heart pounded in his chest. The light stopped near his hut for a moment, then moved on. The hum faded into the distance. He waited several long minutes before lifting the rug and opening the trapdoor. The woman climbed out, her eyes wide, her body trembling. She looked at him, breathing heavily, then whispered something soft and broken, her voice trembling like wind through glass. He didn't know the words, but he understood what she meant. "Thank you." Outside, the night was quiet again, but both of them knew it wouldn't stay that way. The storm might have ended, but something much larger was now unfolding, something that neither of them fully understood. In that moment, he realized she wasn't just a visitor from another world. She was someone running from danger, from something she feared deeply, and now he was part of it too. The morning came quietly after a long, tense night. The world outside the hut was still, covered in endless white. The snow glistened under the pale sunlight, and the cold air pressed against the windows like a frozen breath. Inside, the man sat near the fire, lost in thought. The alien woman sat a few feet away from him, her silver eyes fixed on the small drawing she had made the night before, the one of them sitting together by the fire under the stars. They had both survived the night, but neither had slept much. The strange blue light that had searched the mountains was gone, but its memory lingered in the air like a shadow. She still looked frightened, her movements soft and uncertain, as if any sound could summon it back. He watched her quietly. Every time she looked toward the window, he could tell she was thinking about her world, about the people who might never come for her. It was a kind of sadness he recognized, being far from home, unsure if anyone would ever find you again. After a long silence, she stood up and went to the door. Her hand touched the wooden frame, her fingers tracing the edge slowly. Then she turned to look at him. There was something different in her expression this time. No fear, no panic, just quiet decision. He knew what she meant without her saying a word. It was time for her to go. He rose slowly, his body heavy with emotions he couldn't quite name. Part of him wanted to stop her, to tell her to stay where it was safe, but another part knew he couldn't. She didn't belong here. The world outside wasn't meant for her, but neither was this small hut meant to keep her forever. She had her own sky to return to, her own story to finish. She walked toward the table where his notebook still lay. Carefully, she picked up the pencil again and turned to a blank page. He watched as she drew a new image. This time, it was a symbol he hadn't seen before. It looked like a spiral surrounded by small dots, glowing faintly as the pencil touched the paper. When she was done, she tore the page out gently and handed it to him. He looked at the drawing, then at her, confused. She pointed at his chest, then at the drawing as if to say, "Keep this." Her voice came out softly, speaking a single word, something that sounded like safe or maybe remember. He nodded, tucking the paper carefully into his coat pocket. The wind outside had calmed, and the sky had turned a soft shade of blue. He opened the door for her. The cold rushed in, sharp and clean, filling the hut with a breath of winter. She stepped out slowly, her blanket still around her shoulders, her silver hair catching the light. For a long moment she just stood there, looking out over the frozen valley. The snow stretched endlessly in every direction, untouched and silent. Then she turned back toward him one last time. Their eyes met, and in that quiet exchange, everything that couldn't be said was understood. She raised her hand slightly, a gesture of farewell. He lifted his hand too, his heart heavy but grateful. Then she began to walk. Her steps were slow at first, careful, almost unsure. But as she moved farther from the hut, her pace grew stronger. The light around her seemed to change. The air shimmered faintly, like heat rising off the snow. He stood in the doorway, watching her until she was only a small shape in the distance. The world felt so still it was as if time had stopped. Then, without warning, the air around her began to glow. A faint blue light surrounded her body, soft at first and then brighter, almost blinding. He squinted against it, his breath catching in his chest, and then she was gone. The light vanished into the sky, leaving only silence and snow behind. There was no sound, no explosion, no trace, just emptiness. He stood there for a long time, unable to move. The blanket she had worn lay half buried in the snow a few meters away. Slowly he walked out and picked it up. It was still warm, faintly carrying a scent that reminded him of rain and metal and something he couldn't quite describe, something not of this world. He held it tightly as he turned back toward the hut. Inside, the fire had burned low, glowing softly in the dim light. He sat by it again, the blanket folded neatly beside him, and pulled the notebook onto his lap. The last page she had drawn, the glowing spiral, still glimmered faintly under the firelight. He didn't know what it meant, but somehow it brought him peace. It wasn't a goodbye that felt like loss, it felt like a promise. Days passed and the world outside began to thaw. The snow melted slowly, revealing patches of brown earth and green moss. The air grew softer, warmer. Life returned to the valley in small, quiet ways. But inside the hut, something had changed forever. He found himself thinking about her often, about the sound of her laughter, the glow in her eyes when she discovered something new, the way she had looked at the stars as if they were calling her name. Sometimes, when the nights were clear, he would step outside and look up at the sky, searching for a sign. One night, many weeks later, he saw it. Far above the horizon, among the thousands of cold white stars, there was a faint blue shimmer, small but bright like a whisper in the dark. It pulsed once, twice, and then faded away. He didn't need to wonder what it was. He knew. A slow smile spread across his face. It wasn't sadness he felt anymore, it was peace. He whispered quietly into the night, "Safe journey." From that day on, the world didn't feel so lonely. He still lived in the same hut, still tended his fire, still studied the skies, but something deep inside him had shifted. He no longer looked at the stars as distant or unreachable. They were no longer cold or silent. They were alive, full of stories, and one of those stories was his. Sometimes, when the wind was quiet and the night was still, he swore he could hear her voice in the distance, a soft echo carried by the wind, gentle and familiar. Maybe it was his imagination, or maybe it was her way of reminding him that their worlds weren't so far apart after all. He kept the drawing she gave him close. It became worn over time, the edges creased, the paper faded. But the faint glow in the spiral never disappeared completely. It stayed with him, a constant reminder that he had once met someone from the stars, someone who had changed everything he believed about fear, trust, and kindness. Years later, when travelers passed through the mountains, they would sometimes stop by the old wooden hut and meet the quiet man who lived there. He rarely spoke much, but every now and then, he would show them that drawing, the one of two figures sitting beside a fire under a sky full of stars. When they asked who the other figure was, he would only smile and say softly, "A friend." And though no one ever saw her again, the man never doubted what had happened. The memory of that strange winter, the crash, the storm, and the silent bond they had shared stayed alive in him until his last days. On clear nights, he would step outside, look up at the glowing sky, and whisper words that only the stars could hear. And somewhere far beyond that sky, maybe she heard him too. Because even in a universe filled with distance and silence, a single act of kindness could connect two souls forever. And for one brief moment in a small hut on a snowy mountain, a human and an alien had found something bigger than fear, something that neither time nor space could take away.